targeting is still allowed. The United States government is still allowed to target that group of people. The only difference if you pass the affirmatives plan is that they won't be targeted with drones. And we're going to see why that is such a bad idea in subpoint C of drones are more precise. Drones are more precise. The fact is that drones are actually the most precise weapon that the United States government has in its arsenal. Let's look at a quote from the New York Times, partially quoting Bradley J. Strasser, who is a PhD in philosophy and a research associate at Oxford's Institute for Ethics, Law, and Armed Conflict, and previously taught philosophy at the United States Air Force Academy. So basically, he's an expert on the philosophy of war, very credible to talk about. He's usually talking about the ethics of the drone program. He said last year, quote, Bradley Strasser concluded that using drones to go after terrorists might be ethically obligatory. He said, all the evidence we have so far that drones do better at avoiding collateral damage than anything else we have. End quote. What that simply says is that drones are more precise than any other weapon we have in our arsenal. Any other weapon that the United States were to use would result in more civilian deaths. And given that they can't change to personality strikes for this group, given the reason they're doing signature strikes right now is they can't do personality strike because they don't know the terrorist group's name, they'll simply use other alternatives and use signature targeting, just use a different weapon. Essentially, they'll still target the group, they'll just do it with something else like an airstrike or a raid instead of a drone strike. And the reason that this is so bad is because the alternatives are far worse. Let's look at a piece of evidence from the New York Times again, referencing the study of Avery Plough, PhD, last year. Quote, Avery Plough put the CIA drone record in Pakistan up against the ratio of combatant deaths to civilian deaths in other settings. Even the high-end count of 20% was considerably lower than the rate in other settings. When the Pakistan Army went against militants in the tribal area on the ground, civilians were 46% of those killed. He concluded a fair-minded evaluation of the best data we have available suggests that the drone program compares favorably with similar operations. What he was looking at was the high-end estimate of how many civilians are killed in the drone program, 20%, was half as high, as what we use in the alternatives. When Pakistan tried doing a raid, the civilian casualty rate was 46%. So what does this mean? This means that all the justifications of the affirmatives plan are turned on their head. Justification 1 of terror increased, more civilians will be killed under the affirmatives plan, so if their argument is true here, more terrorists will be recruited. Justification 2 of reputation decreased, more civilians being killed, means our reputation will decrease even more. And justification 3 of signature strikes should be eliminated. They ban a signature drone strike, but not signature targeting. So that's the reason we're asking you to vote for the status quo. Thanks so much. Open to any questions the affirmative speaker may have for me.
Well, I can ask you questions.
All right, hope you have an answer.
All right, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, how are you?
Good, all right. And congratulations again.
You too.
Yeah, all right, so, all right, are we eliminating all drone strikes?
You're not eliminating all drone strikes, but you're eliminating...
Thank you so much, that's all I needed. Sorry, thank you. All right, do you agree that we have to target in order to strike?
Definitely. Don't just strike and then magically go somewhere. You have to target somewhere.
Thank you so much. All right, under your disadvantage, you had one disadvantage, right?
Yeah.
You had 3 subpoints?
Yeah, I believe so.
All right, so your disadvantage was alternative options will have to be used?
The disadvantage tag was alternatives used, yes.
Alternatives used.
Yeah.
Right, and what was subpoint A?
The subpoint A was basically that you don't ban a signature targeting, you just ban signature drone strikes.
Could you just give me the tag for it?
I can't remember the specific tag I said in my speech. It was something like signature targeting.
Okay, signature targeting. Thank you so much.
Sorry if I was speaking too fast.
Oh, no, you were fine.
Okay.
All right, so you talked about how we don't take out these targets because we don't know their name.
What I was talking about was the reason that the United States government would use what you call a signature strike is because they can't identify them well enough for it to be classified as a personality strike. So it's not like post-plan they'll be able to just switch to all personality strikes, is what I was basically saying. There's a reason they use signature strikes. They can't just switch all to personality strikes post-plan.
Okay, because we don't know their name.
Right. Well, you specifically said that signature strikes are used when we don't know the person's name or enough about them, so we can't
it's not just about their name, right?
Well, it's certain things about them, but the fact is, if they could identify and verify more, they would. There's a reason they're using signature strikes, because they can't do personality strikes in these cases.
Great. Thank you so much.
It just makes sense.
Did you bring up any evidence talking about under that point?
Any evidence under that point?
Yeah.
It simply makes sense. If the United States
Did you bring up any evidence, though?
I didn't bring up any evidence suffice except for logic, which is evidence of a kind.
Okay, thank you. I'm agreeing in some instances. All right, did you bring up any evidence that they would use other options for your disadvantage?
Again, I didn't bring up any evidence, but it simply makes sense. They want to target these people, they'll just target them with other weapons.
Okay, but you brought up no evidence under that point.
I didn't bring up any evidence that the government wants to kill the militants they are currently killing.
No. All right, great. Thank you. evidence you read.
First piece of evidence under the Osama bin Laden evidence?
Yeah.
Sure. It's one second. You asked me a question. Here it is right here.
That's all I needed. Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And then do you guys have a definition?
Oh, no, wait.
Thank you. People ready? All right, then I'll begin. I'd like to start off with topicality at the very top. Okay, I had two topicality arguments. First of all, presence. Secondly, commitments. Their only response to presence was simply that we are committed. So we'll assume that they're just going with the commitments, and they'll justify that under that aspect of the resolution. So let's go straight to that. They said that it's the act of binding yourself is their definition, and that since they bind themselves to this policy, it is therefore a foreign military commitment. Now, I'd like to point you back to my definition that actually directly responded to this. Yes, binding yourself to a policy, that creates a policy. That's just what policy is. It's an act of legislation that creates something that the government does. But the piece of evidence that I actually read said that there's a difference between that and an actual policy. It says, people say that the U.S. is committed to a particular policy when they mean only that the administration has adopted that policy, not in any sense that the country is bound to it. Now, actually, what we're looking at in the resolution is the fact that we need a foreign military commitment, which refers to our commitment of our military to some other foreign nation having to do with other foreign nations. Not simply that we have adopted a drone policy. That doesn't necessitate an actual commitment. So that was the essential problem with the way that they justify commitments, because being bound to a policy is just the definition of a policy, not a commitment. Now let's move down to the responses that they made on their case. Now, first of all, she responded by saying that we're generally targeting groups with the signature strikes, and that just targets a group versus actual people. Our response here is that it's groups of militants. It's groups of militants. Now, what we might imagine in our heads is drone strikes hitting towns, killing groups of civilians and militants and leaders. And that's not true. It may have been true in drone strikes in the past, but the United States has actually reformed that. And the evidence that I brought up actually said there are very few civilian deaths due to drone strikes from the Pakistani official. I'd like to bring up additional evidence with specific numbers, talking about how in Pakistan actually, these numbers are from the New American Foundation, August of 2012, and we had 37 drone strikes. There's a chart here. 37 drone strikes in Pakistan in 2012, and out of those drone strikes, out of the people that we killed 177 to 281 militants, which was 91% of the 99% of the casualties. 99% of the casualties in these drone strikes were verifiably militants. Now, why is this different? Al-Qaeda is not made up of leaders. Al-Qaeda is not simply a group of leaders. Now, how they defined militants was that of basically low-level terrorists, people that can't directly do any harm to the United States. Basically, what the evidence they read was talking about is that these people aren't really high up enough to create terror strikes on the United States, therefore they're not directly a threat. Our war is against terrorism and against Al-Qaeda and against these types of militants. Al-Qaeda is not only leaders, Al-Qaeda also is a group of militants. That's what they are. Yes, they do have leaders, and yes, we should be targeting those leaders, but if we're ever going to win the war, we also have to target the majority of them, which are simply militants. So let's move down they talked about how, again, that it actually creates terrorism because of these drone strikes, so we actually increase terror. So my response here is out of civilian deaths caused. Civilian deaths caused. Now, all of their evidence actually talked about drone strikes increasing terrorism when we kill civilians. While it may have been true years ago, as the two pieces of evidence that I've already brought up say, with the statistics, 2012, 99% of the people we killed out of our 37 drone strikes were militants. It means only 1% were civilians. And again, from the Pakistani government, they believe there's very few civilians killed. So when we're not actually killing civilians now, there's no reason why people would turn to terrorism. So the link under all of their evidence actually falls down. When we're killing the majority of militants, we're actually helping the war on terror. We're not increasing our threat. Secondly, she said that there's a growing hatred for America anyway, and that they're not actually a harm to the United States. Again, we're talking about these militants that actually comprise these terrorist groups. While they may not be the leaders, we do need to target them. So in the end, we're looking at signature strikes, which are key to actually taking out groups of militants, groups of Al-Qaeda, groups of terrorists. While we may not have a named leader, or while we might not know like the specific names of the terrorists, as their own evidence said, we have to have sufficient proof that they are militants that we're fighting, that they are part of Al-Qaeda, and while we may not have a leader in them, if bin Laden, for instance, wasn't in the group, that doesn't mean that we should not target a running group of terrorists, and that's why we have the signature strikes. So for this reason, I would ask you to support the status quo to decrease terrorism in it. Thank you very much.
You can start. Okay. And can we actually have our pieces of evidence back?
Sure, no problem. And if you're missing one, let me know.
I will. Seconds remaining.
Or you can stop it from the correct time.
Is everyone ready? All right, Judge, in this first affirmative rebuttal, I have a lot to cover. So I'm just going to be going down the flow and addressing both the 2 in C and the 1 in C together as they come into the places where they belong on the flow. Starting right at the top with topicality. But first of all, where we've been talking about whether or not this is a foreign military commitment. Now, our answer to this is obviously it is a foreign military commitment. We've talked a lot about what the definition of commitment is, and I'd like to bring you back to our definition of commitment, which we presented in the 1AC, and it says, the act of binding yourself to a course of action. Now, the negative team has claimed that we are just binding ourselves to a specific policy, but this is actually not the case. We're binding ourselves to a course of action that we are consistently and constantly upholding in the Middle East right now. But the problem is that we need to change this. And it's also very obvious it is a military commitment. It is in a foreign country, so we know that we uphold all 3 of those, a foreign military commitment. All right, now moving down to inherency, where we've talked about the majority of signature strikes. And they were talking about how we've had some success in this. Yes, we have had some success, but we also see that we are making the problem worse. My partner brought up a piece of evidence saying that only about 13% of our strikes have been successful. Now, basically because we know what a signature strike is. We know that a signature strike is when we have no idea who we're actually targeting, and we don't figure out who it is afterwards. So all of this success, we didn't figure out that it was successful until after the strike had happened. What this means is that that 13% is not a success rate, it's a luck rate. And that's what we are basing our national security on. All right, now, Moving down, we've talked about militants being killed versus civilians being killed. My first response is that civilians are being killed, but that is not the only problem. Civilians aside, we need to look at these militants that are in the status quo and that we have actually been targeting in the status quo. Now, the negative team would have you believe that these are terrorists who are attacking the United States, but that is not the case. And they have brought up no evidence to show that we're at war with these militants. They brought up no evidence to show that these militants are a threat. And to the contrary, the affirmative team has proven that these militants are not a threat to the United States. And also we see, they also said that only the civilian deaths cause people to turn to terrorism, but that is not the case. I have this piece of evidence here from Tom Parker that talks about how every strike brings 3 to 4 new suicide bombers. And it says, quote, before he was killed, Batullah Masood, leader of the Tehrik-i-Taliban in Pakistan, considered drones a wonderful recruitment tool. He once told a local reporter, every drone strike brings me 3 or 4 new suicide bombers, unquote. So we see that this problem of terrorism is not just coming from civilian deaths, it's also coming from the deaths of these militants who are not a threat. So basically we take a non-threat in the status quo, people who aren't against us, and now they hate us. That is not an effective policy, and it's not something that we should go with. All right, now quickly moving down, I'd also like to point out that the negative team is doing the same thing our government is by saying this about the militants. They're assuming on no known basis that these militants are against us. That is exactly what our government does, and they just do go willy-nilly killing people because, and without knowing who they are. All right, now in the 2NC, he talked about how we're not stopping the targeting. Pretty much when you do a signature strike, we are switching the targeting. Basically, we're changing the rules about who we target. We're targeting the people who are a threat and who are actively plotting against the United States. It could be leaders, it could be anyone who we know for sure is actively plotting against the United States for our protection. So we are changing the strikes, we're changing what's important. Now quickly addressing the no high degree of confidence. Basically this talks about how the negative team believes we don't know very much about personality strikes. The fact is that we know that personality strikes work in the status quo. There are very good rules about this, and the government will not be able to get around it. All right. We also talked how we can't solve all the hate. We cannot solve all the hate, we understand this. This is a comparative advantages case, which basically means we're trying to make the status quo better. And we do see that under the status quo we create terrorism, and underneath our plan we do not create terrorism. That is more effective, and that is why we urge you to vote affirmative. Now moving down to his disadvantage, he talked about an alternative. Well, basically my first response is logically this doesn't make sense. Because we have proved very effectively that these militants aren't a threat to the United States, we don't need an alternative. We don't need an alternative, and that is extremely logical. But we also have a second response that's rather team policy-like response. They brought up no evidence proving that we would use an alternative. So, Judge, what I would like to leave you is, do you want to base our national security on a 13% luck rate, or do you want to base our national security on something that works and something that is effective? Thank you.
Two minutes remaining. One minute, 30 seconds remaining.
Thank you. Are you ready? Affirmative?
Yes.
And Megan? And Tyra? Thank you so much. All right. At first sight, Bradley Strasser resembles a humanities professor from Central Casting. He has a beard, wears jeans, quotes Augustine, and calls himself, only half in jest, a hippie. Strasser is also, it turns out, an outspoken advocate for drone strikes. Strasser has argued the United States is not only entitled but morally obliged to use drones, end quote. This is essentially what we're talking about in today's debate on, is that drones, we are morally required to use them because of the precision that they provide us with. And this is what we're going to be talking about in my last speech of today's debate round, as we close it out from the negative perspective, looking at 3 voting issues, 3 reasons to vote for the negative team. The first voting issue, which has nothing to do with any of the issues, is that of topicality. Now we're going to be looking at the issue of military commitments here, and whether or not their plan falls under this, given they did say that they don't fall under presence as just commitments, so we're just going to look at that one. So under commitments, basically what they've been saying throughout today's debate round is that they define it in the 1AC as being bound to a course of action. I'd like to point out we are allowed to counter-define and bring up our own definition. It's not like they bring up a definition of the 1AC means that that's the only definition that can be in the round. That would mean that they could bring up a definition of commitments as repealing Obamacare or something, and we couldn't contest that. Obviously, we can bring up our own definition. And our definition specifically refuted the claim made by the affirmative team. It specifically said that the word commitment is used very broadly. People say the United States is committed to a particular policy when they mean only the administration, the current administration, the administration has adopted that policy. It continues to say, yet the dictionary definition of commitment speaks of the pledging or binding of an individual to a particular course of action. And a meaningful international commitment must include that element of promise. What he's talking about here is that it has to be internationally binding. He continues to say, commitment is the antithesis of freedom. The test of its existence is that some restriction be imposed on the committed nation's absolute freedom of action. End quote. What this is essentially saying is that in order for something to be a commitment, it has to be binding on the United States in a way that we can't change, like a treaty, for example. If a treaty such as, if a nation such as South Korea were attacked and we have a treaty with them, we have to go to their defense. It's different with drone strikes. We can just stop drone strikes because it's a unilateral policy. It's not in any way a commitment. This definition clearly makes the affirmative team fall outside the resolution, and it is a better definition, seeing as their definition was from a dictionary or something, and our definition was from a PhD in law, so it's obviously better. Now let's move down to the second voting issue, which is that of effective policy. We're going to be looking at the different issues under the case here. Now, before we go to anything, I'd like to go to the argument about whether or not they get rid of signature targeting. Now, they said in their last speech that they switch all targeting to personality targeting. That's not in their mandate. What their mandate says is end signature drone strikes. It does not say end the practice of signature targeting. Their mandate would definitely allow the government to use signature targeting to target a group of militants and then use airstrikes or raids on them. That is definitely allowed under the affirmative team's plan. Additionally, they said that we know that personality strikes work. Against my argument about the high degree of confidence, they said we know personality strikes work. I'd like to point out they didn't respond to my argument that the government doesn't actually use these real terms, so we don't really know if the government knows if they work because the government doesn't use those terms, so that just isn't really, that doesn't really work. Let's look down to the justification of terrorism. Now, they said in their last speech that the militants are not dangerous. Before we go into anything here, I'd like to point out, if these terrorism militants are not dangerous, why does the affirmative team have a justification that terrorism and militants are increased with the current drone strikes? If the militants were not an issue, it wouldn't be an advantage in their plan. Just a quick point there. But regardless of that, the affirmative team said in the last speech that the militants are not dangerous. However, I read evidence in my speech, and my partner did as well, that the militants are considered dangerous by the United States federal government. They are a threat to the United States. Even if they're not all Osama bin Ladens who are planning attacks, they are the recruits and they need to be dealt with. Additionally, they said, I read a piece of evidence that Osama bin Laden hates the drone program because it's so good. And they said, well, we've had success, but we're making the problem worse. I'd like to just point out, Osama bin Laden did not, I guess because he's dead now, but he did not like the drone program. In fact, he would probably love the affirmative team's plan, which that alone is a reason to vote against it. Now let's go down into the third reason to vote negative, which is that of civilian deaths increase. Civilian deaths increase. And here we're going to go to the disadvantage of alternatives use. Now, they basically said that I don't have evidence that we would turn to alternatives, and just between you and me, the reason I didn't have evidence is because their case isn't topical. But besides that point, what we were talking about here was basically that it's just logical. The reason that the government is using signature strikes right now is because they aren't able to provide enough verification due to personality strikes. That doesn't change post-plan. Post-plan, they will turn to alternatives to be able to target these militants instead. They said that this doesn't make sense because the militants aren't dangerous, but regardless of what the affirmative team thinks, the United States federal government has said that these militants are dangerous and does want to target them. So if you vote for the affirmative team's plan, that increases civilian deaths. They made the claim that civilian deaths aren't what increases terrorism, but the card they read there had no reasons for drone strikes just in general increasing terrorism. The reason that drone strikes tend to increase terrorism is because of the increase in civilian deaths. That gets worse on the affirmative plan. So we're asking you to vote for the status quo. Thank you so much.
Second from Mr. Preston.
One minute remaining. Seconds remaining. Seconds remaining. Prep time expired.
Alright. So my judge ready? And my timer. Make it Alright, great, then I'll start. Alright, so Judge, in this last speech of the whole round, I'm going to be addressing the points my opponent brought up really quick, and then I'm going to be giving you some voting issues of our own. Alright, first, he talked about how drones are good. That's an important point. We agree that drones are good. We are not eliminating all drone strikes, we are simply eliminating our ineffective and inefficient drone strikes in the status quo. We're just eliminating signature strikes. Alright, down to his voting issue of topicality. Alright, I'm going to be moving into my voting issues right now because they're going to be addressing his voting issues. So my first voting issue is actually we're going to be looking at the stock issues, and I know you said you're an LD mom, so I'm going to explain the stock issues really quick. Basically, in team policy, we asked that the judge would vote on the 4 stock issues. They are basically what holds up the debate round. So my first stock issue is that of topicality. And this has been contested a lot in today's debate round, so I'm just going to be clearing it up really quick. So they talked about commitments and binding commitments, and again, we did bring up the definition of commitment. We are allowed to define it. There's no reason to prefer their definition, no matter how professional their person who defined it was, and then again, it was a long time ago. All right, then moving on, and we are creating a binding commitment in the status quo. This is a binding commitment to our government. They are going to be bound to this law and policy, and this is actually a policy in the status quo. That's our drone policies. So, we are making this binding on the government, and it is a policy. I hope that clears up the topicality argument for you. So it is topical. This is a foreign military commitment. So, moving on to inherency. Inherency, basically the problems in the status quo. We can see that the problems in the status quo is that we're hurting civilians, and we're creating more terrorists by killing these so-called militants. All right, so we know that we are actually creating terrorists. I read several pieces of evidence under this, and I'm going to be reading another piece of evidence for you right now, talking about how attacks have increased in 2013. They brought up pieces of evidence talking about how they've been low, but that was not very recent. My piece of evidence is actually from just this year, earlier this year, and this is taught from Greg Miller in the Washington Post, January 10th, 2013. It says, quote, "The CIA has opened the year with a flurry of drone strikes in Pakistan. A strike Thursday in North Waziristan was the 7th in 10 days, marking a major escalation in the pace of attacks. The Pakistani government has not publicly protested the step of drone strikes, but reports suggest that they have caused higher than usual civilian casualties. Bill Rogo, who tracks drone activity in Pakistan for the Long War Journal website, said preliminary information indicates that as many as 11 civilians, along with 30 militants, have been killed so far this year. I'd like to point out that this piece of evidence was from January 10th, and as of that point, at least 11 civilians, if not more, had been killed, and 30 militants had also been killed. So we can see that this has actually been increasing from this piece of evidence. We can see that the drone program has actually been increasing. We've been killing civilians just this year. So I asked you for our piece of evidence to that. And that's one of the problems in the status quo, is that we're killing civilians and creating terrorists. We are definitely creating terrorists in the status quo. I'd like to bring you back to the piece of evidence my partner read about the former terrorist leader who said that he considered drones a wonderful recruitment tool. He once told a local reporter, every drone strike brings me 3 or 4 new suicide bombers, simply because of the drone strikes. And we brought up other pieces of evidence talking about how this created terrorism, specifically how signature strikes specifically create terrorism. All right, I'm going to be moving on to a couple of other things. We talked about signature targeting, how we can't change that. We are changing the targeting. Our mandate specifically says, U.S. drones will no longer be allowed to carry out signature drone strikes in any country. Personality strikes will be authorized, but limited to the extent necessary to eliminate the high-value target terrorists who are actively plotting against the United States. We're simply changing the target to high-value terrorists. All right, moving on to my next voting issue of solvency. Essentially, we are setting out to solve a problem in the real world. The problem we are trying to solve for is terrorism, or creating more terrorists. We are solving for that by stepping away from this drone program, abolishing signature strikes, and saying this creates terrorists. We don't want to create terrorists. We don't want to have more work on our hands for the war on terror, and abolishing that. We are solving for the war on terror because we've seen numerous pieces of evidence how this creates terrorism. And finally, significance. This is a very significant plan. Obviously, the war on terror is a significant issue. And my last voting issue for you today would be that of a lack of evidence. The negative team provided very little and hardly any specific evidence on many of the points we argued today, so we ask that you would prefer the affirmative team's evidence. We ask for all of these reasons that you would vote affirmative and change the status quo and stop creating more work for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for judging.
You know, everyone want to see your son or something.
No problem.